For 31 years, my father introduced me to every new person he met the exact same way. Not as his daughter. As his daughter from his first marriage, like a footnote attached to a sentence that was really about someone else. 6 weeks after his funeral, a courtroom clerk in Topeka slid a sealed envelope across a table. The document inside it said something my father never once said to my face in his entire life. My full name is Callista Ashdown. I am 34 years old now, and I own a small greenhouse and flower shop on the edge of Topeka, Kansas. It's the kind of business that survives on regular customers and word of mouth more than anything flashy. My father's death didn't change my business or my daily life in any obvious way. But it did change what I understood about the 31 years that came before it. That change started with a will reading that told me almost nothing, and a document, buried where nobody thought to look, that told me everything. Let me take you back to the beginning of all this, to a mother I barely remember, and a father who spent 3 decades keeping a part of himself locked away. My mother, Eloise, died when I was 3 years old. It was a sudden illness, one nobody in my family likes to describe in much detail even now. I don't remember her voice. I have exactly one photograph of the two of us, taken at a lake somewhere in Missouri. I have kept that photograph in every home I've ever lived in, moved from apartment to apartment, taped inside different journals across different decades. My father remarried when I was 5 to a woman named Ginevra. Within 2 years, they had my half-brother Thaddeus, and 2 years after that, my half-sister Rosanna. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. Ginevra was never cruel to me, not in any way I could have pointed to as a child. She fed me, clothed me, and showed up to my school events when her schedule allowed it. The wound in this story isn't about Ginevra. It's about my father and the particular, quiet way he drew a line around his second family. A line that never once fully included me. The line showed up in small ways for years before I understood it as a pattern. Family photographs on the mantel were always labeled, in Ginevra's careful handwriting, with everyone's names. Except mine was written slightly smaller, tucked into a corner, as though someone had run out of room. At my high school graduation, my father gave a toast to the kids. Somehow, in the retelling of that story at every family gathering afterward, the toast became a toast to Thaddeus and Rosanna, and my presence at that same table simply went missing from it. I used to tell myself I was being oversensitive. Families are messy, I told myself, and nobody keeps score the way children secretly do. But the introductions were the thing I could never quite explain away. Every single time, at every wedding, every funeral, every chance meeting with someone from his work, my father would say the same sentence. This is my daughter from my first marriage. Never simply my daughter. Always the qualifier, offered so smoothly it clearly wasn't new, like a habit worn into a stare. I remember a specific summer, when I was around 9, that I still think about more than almost any other memory from that house. Ginevra had organized a family portrait session, the professional kind, with a photographer who came to our backyard and arranged us on a wooden bench under the big oak tree. She positioned Thaddeus and Rosanna on either side of my father, close in, their small hands resting on his knees. She positioned me a half step behind, near my father's shoulder. Close enough to be included in the frame, but distinctly separate from the tight cluster at its center. I don't think Ginevra did this with any cruelty in mind. It was simply how she pictured the family, without quite noticing she was picturing it that way. The photograph still hangs in my father's old house, in the hallway outside what used to be his study. Every time I walk past it, I find myself again in that same half-step back, exactly where the camera left me. I confronted him about it exactly once, when I was 26. I was home for a holiday that had gone sideways over some small disagreement about seating at dinner. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, why he never just called me his daughter. The way he called Thaddeus and Rosanna his kids, without any qualifier at all. He looked genuinely confused by the question, the way people look when a habit is pointed out to them for the first time. He said he didn't mean anything by it, that it was just accurate information, since I was, after all, from his first marriage. I told him it didn't feel like accurate information. It felt like a label that kept me at a careful distance in every room, at every gathering for my entire life. He didn't apologize. He said I was reading too much into an old habit. The conversation ended there, unresolved. The way most real conversations about old wounds tend to end, in families that value politeness over honesty. I want to tell you about my mother's absence honestly. I think it shaped more of this story than I understood for a long time. Growing up motherless, in a house with a stepmother and two younger siblings, meant I was never quite sure which category I belonged to. Not fully a child of that household, since I remembered, faintly, a different mother, a different beginning. But not an outsider either, since it was the only home I actually had. I built my own quiet identity in the gaps of that uncertainty, and greenhouses, oddly enough, became part of how I did it. My mother had loved gardening, according to the few relatives who'd known her. When I was 14, I started volunteering at a community greenhouse 2 blocks from our house, mostly because it felt like the closest thing to knowing her I had left. That volunteer work became a part-time job in college. The part-time job became, eventually, a business of my own, one my father never once asked a real question about, in over a decade of owning it. College gave me the first real distance I'd ever had from that house. I took it seriously. I stayed on campus most holidays. Under the thin excuse of a part-time job I didn't actually need the money from. I studied horticulture, mostly because it let me spend my days somewhere green and quiet, away from dinner tables and toasts and mantel photographs. My professors used to tell me I had a careful, patient hand with difficult plants. It's the kind that need consistent attention rather than dramatic intervention. I remember thinking, more than once, that I'd had a lot of practice being patient with things that grew slowly, or not at all, depending on conditions I couldn't fully control. I didn't make the connection to my father out loud, not back then. I made it privately, in the quiet of a greenhouse at 2 in the morning, tending seedlings nobody had asked me to tend. The way I'd apparently been tending a version of belonging nobody had asked me to keep tending either. I met my husband, Roland, at that same greenhouse, actually, when he came in looking for a birthday gift for his own mother. He left, an hour later, with my phone number instead of a single flower. He proposed 2 years after that, in that same greenhouse, among the ferns, and I remember laughing so hard I could barely say yes. It felt like the most honest place either of us could have chosen. My father came to the wedding. He gave a short toast. He referred to me, one final time, as his daughter from his first marriage, in front of every guest, on what should have been an entirely different kind of day. I remember catching Roland's eye across the room and seeing him flinch on my behalf before I'd even fully registered it myself. If any part of this sounds even a little familiar, if any of it echoes something in your own life, stay with me a while longer. If you've ever spent years being quietly categorized by someone who is supposed to love you without qualification, this next part matters. What happened after my father's death changed the meaning of every one of those qualifiers in a way I never saw coming. But first, I want to ask you something, because this channel exists for people who have lived exactly this kind of quiet exclusion. If there's a phrase, a label, a specific way someone in your life has always introduced you, one that never quite sat right, drop it in the comments below for me. I read every single one, and I think those small phrases deserve to be named out loud, the way I'm finally naming mine. My father died 18 months ago of a heart attack, quickly and without much warning, at the age of 68. I got the call from Ginevra on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of watering the greenhouse's back rows. I remember setting the hose down so carefully, so precisely, as though finishing that ordinary task correctly could somehow hold the rest of the day together. The funeral was small, mostly coworkers and a handful of extended family. I stood beside Roland near the back, watching Thaddeus and Rosanna receive condolences at the front, in the position that had always, wordlessly, belonged to them. Nobody excluded me from the service itself. Nobody needed to. The seating arrangement did the work on its own, the same quiet architecture that had organized every family gathering of my entire life. The will reading happened 3 weeks later, in a modest law office downtown. Ginevra, Thaddeus, Rosanna, and I sat around a conference table while my father's longtime attorney read through the document in a flat, careful voice. The house went to Ginevra, outright, entirely, which surprised absolutely no one in that quiet room. It was, after all, the house she had lived in for nearly 30 years. The one where Thaddeus and Rosanna had grown up. I remember feeling nothing in particular when that line was read. No surprise and no resentment, simply the flat confirmation of something that had never been in question. The investment accounts were split between Thaddeus and Rosanna in amounts substantial enough that I watched Rosanna's hand tighten around her coffee cup as the numbers were read aloud. And then, near the end, my name appeared exactly once. It was attached to a single line, leaving me $5,000 and, in the attorney's exact words, my father's collection of gardening books. A phrase that landed in that quiet room like something almost designed to wound. The attorney closed the folder gently when he finished, the way you might close a book you didn't especially enjoy but felt obligated to finish anyway, and asked if anyone had questions. Nobody did, at least not out loud, not in that particular room, in front of everyone else present. I did not cry in that office, not one single tear, and I'll admit that plainly, because I think people expect a certain kind of visible devastation at moments like this. What I actually felt was something closer to a strange, hollow confirmation. Every quiet signal my whole life had ever sent me, every mislabeled photograph, every qualified introduction, had just been formalized into a legal document, read aloud by a stranger in a suit, in front of the two siblings who had never once had to wonder where they stood. Ginevra reached over and squeezed my hand afterward. She said something about how my father had always meant to update things, had simply run out of time. It was the kind of sentence families say to smooth over a wound they'd rather not examine directly. I nodded. I didn't believe her, not because I thought she was lying exactly. It was because I'd stopped expecting anyone in that family to look directly at a pattern I'd been living inside for 3 decades. In the days right after the will reading, before Roland ever raised the idea of a second attorney, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I drove out to the cemetery alone on a weekday afternoon and sat beside my father's still unmarked grave, the headstone not yet installed, just a small temporary marker pressed into the grass. I told him, out loud, feeling foolish and not particularly caring, that I understood now, finally, exactly where I'd stood with him my whole life, and that at least the confusion was over. I want to tell you I felt some kind of peace saying that. I didn't. I felt exhausted and a little cruel toward myself. 3 decades spent hoping the accounting might come out differently than it had. Roland was the one who suggested, gently, a few weeks later, that I at least have my own attorney review the will. Not to contest anything, he said carefully. Just to understand it fully, he said. Grief, he told me, has a strange way of making people accept whatever is placed in front of them without question. I resisted at first. Some tired part of me simply wanted the whole ordeal finished. Filed away, absorbed into the long list of things about my father I'd already learned to live with. But Roland is patient in a way I am not always patient with myself. Eventually, I agreed to at least one consultation, mostly to put the question to rest, rather than out of any real hope that something might turn out different. I want to tell you something else before we go further, something that matters more than it might seem to on its own. During the 2 weeks between the funeral and the will reading, I'd found myself, almost compulsively, going through an old box of my father's papers, ones Ginevra had let me take from his home office. Mostly business receipts and old tax records nobody else wanted to sort through. Near the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band that had long since gone brittle and snapped when I touched it, I found a stack of his old daily planners, going back nearly 15 years. I hadn't looked through them for anything specific. I'd simply wanted something of his handwriting to hold onto, since I owned so little of it. I flipped through a few pages, mostly ordinary appointments and errands, and set them aside in a drawer at home. I didn't think much more about it, until an attorney's question, months later, sent me back to that same drawer with an entirely different purpose. The attorney Roland found for me was a careful, unhurried man named Declan Larkspur, who specialized in estate and probate law. He had, by his own admission, seen almost every strange variation of family favoritism a will could contain, across nearly 30 years of practice. He reviewed the document for nearly 2 hours before he called me back. The first thing he asked came in a tone that made my stomach drop before I understood why. He wanted to know one thing, whether my father had ever mentioned making any changes to his estate plan in the years before his death. I told him no, honestly, Not that I knew of, not ever. Declan said something had caught his attention. A reference, buried in an old amendment log from the law firm's own internal records, to a codicil filed 9 years earlier. One that did not appear anywhere in the will that had actually been read aloud at that conference table. If you're new to this channel, you already know a discovery like that rarely stays buried for long. I promise you it doesn't, not in this story. Subscribe if you want to hear exactly what that 9-year-old codicil said. Subscribe and find out why an entire family sat in a conference room reading it. A version of my father's wishes that turned out not to be the only version that existed. Declan explained it to me carefully, the way I imagine he explains complicated things to a lot of frightened, grieving clients. A codicil, he said, is a legal amendment to an existing will, filed separately, that can add, remove, or change specific provisions without requiring an entirely new document. Properly filed and notarized, it carries the same legal weight as the will itself. The problem, he said, was simple to state but hard to solve. The codicil referenced in the firm's internal log did not appear in my father's official probate file. Not the one submitted to the court, not the one read aloud to our family. Either it had never actually been finalized, which happens more often than people assume. Family members change their minds mid-process and abandon the paperwork. Or it existed somewhere, filed and valid, and had simply been lost, misplaced, or in a scenario Declan raised carefully, without accusing anyone directly, deliberately left out of the file that made it to court. I thought immediately of the daily planners sitting in my kitchen drawer. I went home that same afternoon and went through every single page, methodically, the way I imagine my father himself might have approached the task. On a Tuesday in March, 9 years earlier, in his small, cramped handwriting, I found a single line. Notary, Larkspur and Voss. Amendment. Nothing more than that, just 4 small words, tucked quietly between a dentist appointment and a brief note about picking up mulch for the greenhouse I owned by then. I called Declan immediately. My hands were shaking hard enough that I had to set the planner down twice before I could read the date aloud to him clearly. Declan pulled the notary's records the following week. He called me himself this time, rather than having his assistant relay the update, which I noticed and appreciated more than I said out loud at the time. He confirmed that yes, on that exact date, my father had appeared before a notary at that same firm and signed a document. The notary herself, a meticulous woman named Conception Reyes, had worked at that office for over 20 years. She still kept her own careful logbook, required under Kansas notary regulations, listing every single document she'd ever certified over her entire career. The entry matched. A codicil, properly witnessed, properly notarized, filed with the firm on that date. But the physical copy that should have gone into my father's permanent estate file had never made it there. Somewhere, in the years between that appointment and his death, it had either been lost through simple administrative error or removed. The part that still unsettles me, even now, is how ordinary the explanation turned out to be, once Declan tracked it down fully. The firm had switched office management systems 6 years after my father's original codicil was filed. In the messy digital transition, An entire batch of paper documents from that specific period had been boxed up and sent to an off-site storage facility, mislabeled under a filing clerk's shorthand. Nearly impossible to locate, unless you already knew exactly what you were looking for. Nobody had stolen anything. Nobody had deliberately hidden the truth from me, at least not through any conscious decision made by a living person. My father's real wishes had simply been swallowed by an administrative error, 9 years in the making, sitting quietly in a warehouse outside Wichita while our entire family read a will that no longer reflected what he'd actually decided. Declan filed a formal petition with the probate court to have the storage facility searched under a court order. The firm itself no longer had authority to access records from a period predating their system migration without judicial permission. I remember sitting in my greenhouse on the day the order was granted, surrounded by trays of seedlings I was supposed to be transplanting, unable to focus on anything except my phone. The update didn't come until nearly 6 that evening. It was a single text message from Declan. "Found it. Call me." The codicil, when I finally read it myself, 3 days later in Declan's office, was 2 pages long. Dense with legal language I mostly needed him to translate for me in plain terms. But the substance of it was simple enough that even I, reading it cold, understood exactly what it meant within the first paragraph. My father had amended his will, 9 years before his death, to divide his estate equally among all 3 of his children. Not $5,000 and a box of gardening books. An equal third, the same as Thaddeus, the same as Rosanna, explicitly naming me, in his own chosen language, as his daughter, without a single qualifying phrase attached to it anywhere in either page. I sat in that office for a long time after Declan finished reading it aloud, turning the pages over in my hands. His assistant brought me a glass of water at some point. I remember drinking half of it without really tasting it, my attention still fixed on those 2 pages, on the fact that they had existed, unread, for 9 entire years. I kept looking at my father's actual signature at the bottom. The same signature I recognized from every checkbook and greeting card of my childhood. I want to tell you honestly that my first feeling wasn't triumph. It was something closer to grief arriving late. 9 years late, for a version of my father who had apparently existed briefly, in a notary's office in Topeka. That version vanished back into the man who kept introducing me the same qualified way at every gathering afterward. As though that private moment of correction had never happened at all. I did not immediately understand why he'd made the change and then never told anyone. Never mentioned it, never once altered the way he introduced me in public, even after apparently deciding, on paper, that I deserved to be treated exactly the same as his other 2 children. Declan had a theory, offered carefully, since he'd handled enough estate disputes to have seen versions of this pattern before. Sometimes, he said, people make the right decision privately, on paper, in a moment of genuine clarity, and then lose their nerve, before they ever have to say it out loud to the people whose reactions they're most afraid of. The codicil might have been real remorse. The silence afterward might have simply been cowardice, dressed up as forgetting. We petitioned the court to have the codicil formally recognized and entered into the probate record. Under Kansas law, that required a hearing where all interested parties, meaning Ginevra, Thaddeus, and Rosanna, would be notified and given the opportunity to respond. I want to tell you honestly that I dreaded that hearing more than nearly anything else I've described here tonight. More than the funeral, more than the original will reading. Because it meant sitting across a courtroom from the family I had spent 31 years trying to belong to. Presenting evidence that would force them to see, formally and undeniably, that our father had privately decided I belonged there all along, and had simply never found the courage to say so. The night before the hearing, Declan called me at home, mostly, I think, to make sure I actually slept. He told me something I've held on to since, about the dozens of estate disputes he'd handled over almost 30 years of practice. He said the cases that stayed with him weren't the ones involving the most money or the ugliest accusations. They were the quiet ones, like mine. The ones where a family had simply organized itself around an old, unexamined habit. For so long that nobody left alive could say for certain anymore whether it had started as love, or carelessness, or something in between that never got a name. He said he couldn't promise me the hearing would feel like justice. He could only promise the record would finally, accurately, reflect what my father had actually decided. That, he said gently, was sometimes the only kind of justice a probate court is built to offer. The hearing was held on a gray Thursday morning, in a courtroom smaller and plainer than I'd expected, with a judge named Harriet Voss presiding, careful and unhurried in a way that reminded me, oddly, of Declan himself. Ginevra sat with her own attorney across the aisle, Thaddeus and Rosanna beside her. I watched Rosanna's face carefully as Declan laid out the timeline, the notary log, the storage facility records, and the document itself, entered formally into evidence and projected onto a screen for the whole room to read. Before the hearing resumed from a brief morning recess, I noticed my father's old business partner sitting quietly in the back row. His name was Barrett Cravens, someone I hadn't seen in years and hadn't expected to see there at all. He caught my eye across the room and gave a small, understated nod. Later, in the hallway, he told me he'd read about the hearing date in a probate filing notice, purely by chance. He'd come, he said, because he'd always wondered, privately, why my father spoke of me so differently than he spoke of his other two children, whenever the subject came up at the office. He said he was glad, in his own quiet way, that the record was finally being corrected, even if it had taken this long and this much effort to do it properly. I want to describe the courtroom itself for a moment, because I think the ordinariness of it mattered to how the whole morning felt. It wasn't the kind of dramatic, wood-paneled room you see in television dramas. It was small, carpeted in a flat institutional gray. The fluorescent lighting made everyone's face look slightly tired, no matter how well they'd slept the night before. A single American flag stood in the corner, slightly crooked. The court reporter, a young woman about my own age, typed steadily through every word. I remember watching her hands and thinking something absurd. That somewhere in this building, an entire family's real history was finally being converted into an official record. Keystroke by keystroke, patiently, without any drama at all. Just an ordinary room, one that could have belonged to any government office in the country. Ginevra's attorney, a tall, deliberate man who spoke slowly and chose his words with visible care, argued predictably. The codicil's provenance was uncertain, he said. An administrative error 9 years old couldn't be verified with total confidence, and the family had operated in good faith on the will as originally read. Declan responded with the notary's own sworn testimony, given in person that same morning. She confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that she had personally witnessed my father's signature on that exact document, on that exact date. Her own handwriting proved it, in a logbook she had maintained without a single missing entry for over 20 years. I watched Ginevra's face as Conception Reyes spoke. I watched something in it settle slowly into something that looked less like doubt and more like resignation. During a short recess, before closing arguments, I stepped out into the courthouse hallway to steady myself. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee from a vending machine near the elevators, and I found Rosanna already there, standing near a window, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, both of us watching the parking lot below through the tall courthouse windows, cars arriving and leaving for reasons that had nothing to do with either of us. Then she asked me, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, whether I'd hated all of them all these years, for something none of them had ever fully understood they were doing to me. I told her the truth. I said I hadn't hated them, not really, not even our father, most days. I said I had simply learned to expect less warmth from that particular direction. Less than I let myself hope for from anyone else in my life. That expecting less had become its own kind of quiet exhaustion. One I hadn't fully named, until a courtroom forced me to say it out loud. She didn't say anything else. She just reached over and squeezed my arm, once, gently, the way you might reassure someone before a difficult task rather than after one, before the bailiff called us both back inside. The judge ruled from the bench that same afternoon, finding the codicil valid and properly executed, and ordering the estate redistributed according to its actual terms. It was, Declan told me afterward, one of the more straightforward outcomes he'd seen in a case like this, since the paper trail, once located, left almost no room for genuine dispute. I did not feel triumphant walking out of that courtroom, blinking in the sudden brightness of the afternoon sun outside. I felt strange, and tired, and oddly untethered, the way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried for so long you'd forgotten it had weighed at all. Thaddeus caught up with me in the parking lot before I reached my car, jogging a little to close the distance, his tie already loosened despite the hearing having only just ended minutes earlier. I braced myself, honestly, for anger. The ruling meant a significant portion of what he'd already begun planning around had just been redirected. What he actually said, standing there in that ordinary parking lot with the afternoon sun still bright overhead, surprised me far more than nearly anything else I've told you about here tonight. He said he'd had absolutely no idea the codicil existed, no hint of it ever from anyone. He said he was genuinely sorry. Sorry that it had taken a courtroom and a notary's logbook for any of us to learn what our father had apparently decided, privately, 9 years earlier. He said something else, too, something I've turned over in my mind many times since. He said he'd always assumed, growing up, that I simply didn't want to be counted the same way he and Rosanna were. That my quietness at family gatherings read to him, as a child and then as an adult, like distance I'd chosen. not distance that had been quietly built around me by someone else's habits. Rosanna reached out a few weeks later, texting first to ask if I had time, over coffee, in a conversation that started stiff and uncomfortable. Slowly, carefully, it became something more honest. More honest than any conversation the three of us had ever had while our father was alive. She admitted, quietly, staring into her cup rather than at me, that she'd never once questioned why I was labeled the way I was in every family photograph, every toast, every introduction. She said it had simply been the water we all swam in, invisible because it had always been there. Watching a courtroom formally correct it, she said, slowly and with real effort, had forced her to see, for the first time in her life, how strange and cruel that quiet architecture actually looked from the outside. If this particular part of the story is landing for you, the way I sincerely hope it is, then pause with me here a moment. I want to remind you why this channel exists in the first place. It's for people who have spent years being quietly recategorized by someone who should have simply loved them without conditions attached. Subscribe if a story like this one means something to you, because there's another true story here almost every single day. I promise you, this one isn't finished yet. Roland asked me, the week after the ruling, whether I regretted pursuing any of it. That year had been swallowed by depositions and document requests, by the particular exhaustion of proving something that should never have needed proving in the first place. I thought about it seriously before I answered him, because it deserved a serious answer. I told him no, and I meant it, though I also told him it had cost more than money could measure, a full year of energy I could have spent almost anywhere else. He asked what had made it worth that cost, in the end, and I didn't have a tidy answer ready. I've thought about his question many times since, and the closest I've come to a real answer is this. I needed to know, for certain, one thing: whether the man who raised me had actually seen me the way he saw his other children. Even once, even briefly, even if he never found the nerve to say so while he was alive to say it. Roland handled most of the practical details of the redistribution, the bank transfers and account changes, since I found myself, once it was actually happening, strangely uninterested in the mechanics of it. I signed what needed signing. I answered the questions Declan's office asked me. But the money itself, once it was finally redistributed, mattered less to me than I expected it to, though I won't pretend it didn't matter at all. I used part of my share to expand the greenhouse, adding a second growing room I'd wanted to build for almost 5 years. I named the new section, quietly, without telling anyone why, after the lake in that single photograph of my mother. What mattered more, in the end, was smaller and stranger than money. It was the 2 pages themselves, my father's actual handwriting at the bottom. His own signature affirming, 9 years before his death, that I had always belonged fully to that family, in his own private accounting of things, even when his public habits never once caught up to that private truth. There's a smaller detail from the hearing I haven't mentioned yet, one that stayed with me longer than the ruling itself. When Judge Voss finished reading her decision aloud, she paused, looked directly at me across the courtroom, and added something that wasn't strictly part of the legal record. She said that in nearly 20 years on the probate bench, she had rarely seen a case like this one. Rarely seen a paper trail that so cleanly matched so exactly, what everyone in the room could plainly see sitting in front of them. She said she hoped the ruling gave my family a chance to start over, on terms that finally matched what my father had actually written down. I don't know if judges are supposed to say things like that from the bench. I only know that hearing it mattered. It came from someone with no reason to say it, except that it was true. It mattered more to me than almost anything Declan's careful legal arguments had accomplished that morning. I asked Declan once, near the very end of the case, whether he'd ever seen a codicil like mine before. One that corrected a family's whole architecture and then simply sat silent for 9 years, unspoken and unused. He said he'd seen a handful over 3 decades of practice, though never one that stayed hidden quite this long before finally surfacing. He told me most people, once they've made a decision like that on paper, eventually find some way to let it slip. A comment at a holiday dinner, a slightly different tone in an old age. My father, he said, must have been an unusually disciplined man. Disciplined enough to carry a private correction that heavy for that long, without ever once letting it show. I don't know if disciplined is the word I would have chosen myself, but I understood, hearing it from someone who'd spent a career watching families like mine, that it wasn't nothing either. I still don't fully understand why he never told me. I've turned the question over more times than I can count, sitting alone in the greenhouse some evenings after Roland has gone to bed, surrounded by the particular quiet that only plants and glass walls seem to hold. Declan's theory, the one about private clarity and public cowardice, is probably as close to an answer as I'll ever actually get. My father was, by every account I've ever heard, a careful man, uncomfortable with confrontation. More willing to correct a mistake on paper, quietly in a notary's office, than to correct it out loud, in front of the people whose reactions he feared. I don't think that makes what he did to me for 31 years acceptable. But I think it makes him, at least, a little more human. More human than the alternative explanation I'd carried for most of my life. The one where he simply never thought of me as fully his at all. I saw Conception raise once more, months after the hearing, entirely by accident. It was at a farmer's market on the edge of Topeka, where I sometimes sell cut flowers on weekends. She recognized me before I recognized her, and told me, a little shyly, that she still thought about my case sometimes. It was the first time in over 20 years of notary work that her own careful record-keeping had actually changed something. Changed the outcome of someone's life in a way she could see so clearly. I told her it had. I told her that 4 words in a stranger's logbook had done more good. More to correct 31 years of my life than any conversation I'd ever had with the man who wrote them. She got quiet for a moment. Then she said that was, in a strange way, exactly why she'd taken the job so seriously for so long, on the chance that someday, for someone, the boring record would turn out to matter enormously. I think often about a conversation I had with Ginevra a few weeks after the ruling, one I haven't mentioned yet because I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it. She invited me to lunch, alone, without Thaddeus or Rosanna present, at a small cafe near her house. She told me she'd known about the family portrait, the one with me positioned a half step back. She said she'd never once thought about how it might look to a 9-year-old child watching herself get arranged that way. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness, exactly, since she wasn't certain she deserved it. She said she simply wanted me to know that she'd finally seen it, the pattern, the whole quiet architecture of it, and that seeing it had cost her something too, in its own smaller way. I told her I appreciated her saying so. I didn't tell her it changed everything between us, because it hasn't, but it was a real conversation. The first one we'd ever had that wasn't performing politeness for an audience of two other people. Ginevra and I have not fully repaired things. I'd rather admit that plainly, here and now, than offer you a tidier ending than the one I actually got. We are polite at family gatherings now, careful with each other, in a way that feels more like a truce than genuine warmth. I've made a kind of peace with that. I no longer need her approval to know where I actually stood in my father's private accounting of his own family. Last month, Thaddeus asked if he could bring his 2 kids by the greenhouse on a Saturday, mostly, he said, because his daughter had started asking questions about the aunt she barely knew. I said yes. I spent an entire afternoon showing an 8-year-old how to repot a fern without damaging its roots. Thaddeus stood nearby the whole time, watching us both with an expression I couldn't quite name. Later, loading his car, he told me his daughter had asked him, on the drive over, why she'd never met me before that day. He said he hadn't had a good answer for her, and that the question had bothered him more than he expected, the whole way home. I told him he didn't owe me an answer either, not really, not for a pattern he'd inherited rather than built himself. He said he wanted to give her a better one anyway, going forward, and I believed him. Thaddeus and I have grown closer than I ever expected, meeting for coffee every few weeks now. It feels less like siblings catching up on lost time and more like 2 adults slowly discovering they actually like each other. Independent, finally, of the family architecture that once kept us at a careful distance. Rosanna and I are getting there too, slower, more tentative, but real. Before I share the last few things I want to leave you with tonight, I want to say clearly why this channel matters to me, and I hope it's starting to matter to you too. It exists because of people willing to sit through a story like this one, all the way to the end, the same way I hope you're still here with me now. If any part of this reached you, even a small part, if any of it reminded you of your own family's quiet architecture, subscribe and stay a while, because there's always another true story waiting here for you. I still have my father's old daily planners, all 15 years of them, sitting on a shelf in my own study now instead of Ginevra's kitchen drawer. I go through them sometimes, on evenings when the greenhouse is quiet. Not looking for anything specific anymore, just reading his handwriting the way you might reread an old letter from someone you're still learning to understand. I've found other small entries since that first discovery, nothing as significant as the codicil, but small things. A note about picking up a plant for my birthday one year, never actually given to me, sitting unexplained in the margin of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. A reminder to call and ask about my greenhouse's grand opening, also never acted on, at least not that I remember. I don't know what to do with entries like that, except to notice them and let them sit alongside everything else. Everything I've learned, slowly, about a man who apparently thought about me far more than he ever let show. Roland and I talk sometimes about what we'll tell our own children someday, if we're lucky enough to have them, about how families quietly decide who belongs and who doesn't. I don't have a clean answer yet, but I know what I want for them. A house where nobody has to wait 31 years and a courtroom hearing to hear the word daughter spoken without a single qualifier attached to it. That's a small thing to want, maybe, compared to everything this story has actually been about. But it's the thing I find myself returning to most on quiet evenings, when the greenhouse is empty and the only sound left is water dripping slowly through the irrigation lines. There are a few things I want to leave you with. The way this document, once found, left something with me that I don't think I'll ever fully set down. The first is this: being quietly excluded by someone who is supposed to love you unconditionally is, I think, one of the strangest wounds a person can carry. It rarely announces itself as exclusion. It arrives in small phrases, small habits, small architectural choices, repeated so consistently over so many years that you eventually mistake the pattern for simply how things are, rather than a choice someone else kept quietly making. The second thing is that people are sometimes more complicated and more contradictory than the roles they play in our lives. This applies to the people who wrong us, just as much as it applies to the people we love most easily. I think that's a harder truth to sit with than either version alone would be. My father excluded me publicly for 31 years and privately corrected that exclusion on paper with his own signature 9 years before he died. Both of those things were true about the same man. I don't think understanding that makes the public wound hurt any less. But it did make the private correction mean more, once I finally found it, than a simple villain's redemption arc ever could have. The third thing I want to leave you with is smaller in scale, but no smaller in weight, and it has stayed with me quietly since that gray Thursday morning in that plain, fluorescent-lit courtroom. Institutions move slowly and imperfectly, and administrative errors happen constantly, in ways that have nothing to do with justice or malice at all. But sometimes, if you're patient enough and lucky enough to have someone gently insisting you look closer, the truth is still sitting there. Filed correctly, waiting in a warehouse outside Wichita for someone to finally ask the right question. The fourth thing I want to leave you with is about the space between a private decision and a public one. I don't think I understood, before this happened to me, how wide that space could actually be inside a single person. My father made the right choice once, alone, in a notary's office, and then spent 9 more years failing to make it again, out loud, in front of the people who needed to hear it most. I don't think that makes the 9 years of silence forgivable. But I no longer think a person is only their bravest private moment or only their most cowardly public one. Sometimes they are both, uncomfortably, at the exact same time. The people left behind are the ones who have to decide which version to carry forward. And the last thing, the one I keep coming back to on quiet evenings in the greenhouse, surrounded by trays of seedlings that don't care one bit about family history. Vindication doesn't erase the years that came before it. It simply exists alongside them, a second, truer story layered over the first one, and you get to decide, slowly, how much weight each version carries going forward. I have chosen to carry both. The 31 years of being introduced as a footnote, and the 9 years my father spent trying to correct that footnote, silently and imperfectly, before he ever found the courage to say the correction out loud. If this story reached something in you, tell me in the comments below. Tell me about a document, a phrase, or a single moment, one that finally told you the truth about where you actually stood with someone. I read every single one. I think they matter more than most of us are ever given the space to say. Thank you, truly and sincerely, for staying with me all the way through this one tonight, from the very first line to this last one. I will see you again very soon, in the very next story, and I genuinely hope you bring whatever quiet thing you're still carrying along with you, wherever you go next.